just design thinking, building systems, building processes, thinking about second, third order effects. I was going to say it used to be the hardest part of building a community or building a business. I think it's still the hardest part, but it's the thing that gives me the most energy. And if I had to trace this back to anything, I think it's all of those hours spent playing Civilization as a kid that made me. Some decisions you make when you're building a process is really hard to reverse. So I think the stakes can be extremely high, but it's also interesting to play with leverage. I found a sort of means of self-improvement, which can be building a business, which can be building an organization.
Welcome to Entrepreneur's Handbook Podcast, where we share inspiring startup stories with practical takeaways for you, the listener. Today's guest is Dru Riley, the founder of Trends.vc. Now, a few years ago, Dru did what many of us hope to do. He quit his 9-to-5 and just travelled and took a sabbatical for years. He learned about himself, he learned about what made himself tick, and eventually he decided, okay, I want to start going back to work again. And he tried a few different startups, and Trends.vc is one that is now thriving. They've got a newsletter with over 50,000 subscribers, which is all about reports on different areas interesting to entrepreneurs that they can use to grow and accelerate their learning in. And Dru is all about being concise. And you'll see that in this interview as he gives off value bomb after value bomb. Welcome to Entrepreneur's Handbook, Dru. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
So how we connected is because I'm part of your Trends.vc Pro tribe. And I really enjoyed it because one of the things that's been difficult for me once I became a full-time entrepreneur, full-time creator, is having that community. And especially during the pandemic, I really struggled because you can't meet up with people as easily. And even you go to a co-working space like WeWork, often people don't actually talk very much. And that's something that surprised me. And you've got a great bunch of people in there. But your journey to come to this point has been really interesting, and it's not something which you came fresh out of university and you started your entrepreneurship journey. You started as an engineer first. Could you tell the audience a bit more about how you got to where you are today?
Sure. So it depends on how far we want to go back. I'll just start at college. And I was just telling someone this in one of our events, Trends Tribe, but I started out as an accounting major and switched to IT. And came out of school where my first full-time job was as a developer. So I'm a developer by trade. And I did Ruby on Rails development for about 4 or 5 years. So just full stack development. Over time, I moved to the back end and just did some back end work. And that was my last full-time job, consulting for a company. It was part of a conglomerate, but the part of the company I was focused on did used auto auctions. So after that consulting gig, took a 3-year sabbatical and I knew that I didn't want to go back to work for anyone, but I didn't leave that job or leave that gig with any plans of what to build. It was just take time off, read, travel, learned. I picked up a few new hobbies, jujitsu, improv, and so sabbatical came up towards an end, and I was running out of money and still was enjoying the freedom and didn't want to go back to work for anyone else. And I just started building different things. It was very much of the ethos of 12 startups in 12 months, where I just sequenced different things that I was building. And it feels, in retrospect, like I combined different ideas. So a newsletter was part of that. A book was part of that. A mobile app was part of that. A SaaS was part of that. And I took lessons from each one of those things. And it feels like I folded them into Trends.vc, which at first it wasn't obvious how it would work out. Even though these other ideas didn't necessarily work out, it felt like the, path of revenue or profitability was clear, but I just couldn't stick with them. So I inverted the question and asked, what could I stick with instead of what clearly had a route to revenue, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I completely appreciate that as well, because I think one of the things I'm experiencing at the moment is that I know different ways I can make money. That's not necessarily the difficult thing. It's like I said, what's got longevity? What's got sustainability? What do I actually want to be doing in a year's time or 2 years' time? And what about trends makes it something that you want to stick to?
Yeah, so we have to talk about how trends started. Before I get there, I wanted to sort of add to something that you said. The reason why I think this question that you and I ask ourselves a lot is because of the concept of compounding. So that's the second order effect of this. If we do pick things that we can stick with, the way that compounding works, most of the benefits are going to come towards the end of the process. So you can switch targets if you want, but you pay this switching cost and you never really benefit from compounding. So even if something doesn't look promising at first, but you can stick with it and you can tweak the idea and pivot, as long as that essence of what interests you is still there, you reap all of those benefits of compounding. The question was, what about Trends.vc? What kernel was there that felt like I could stick with? The way that Trends.vc started out, it was not a community. If you asked me, hey, would this become a community? The answer would have probably been no. It was this idea of these research reports, this idea of framework-based research. And I would just look around the world, look at different businesses, look at different industries and say, okay, that's neat, or these things seem coupled or grouped together, even though they're not clearly connected. They seem related in my mind. And I wanted to sort of write to organize thoughts and make those relationships clear. Again, it wasn't clear how this would be monetized or if it could be monetized. And I just started to follow that interest and release those reports, those framework-based reports. And people found them interesting. And the mastermind group that I was in at the time, called 0 to 1, were very supportive, very encouraging. Every report I released, they shared. And that helped build this flywheel of interest that was sort of like the seed that ignited Trends.vc.
I know you're also part of the indie hackers community as well. And how much do you think like the communities you join and you're part of enable Trends.vc to take off? You mentioned 0 to 1, there's indie hackers. Was that a really key part of that initial growth?
Yeah, that's a great point that you bring up, because it's all path dependent, where I would have never met the people in 0 to 1 if it wasn't for indie hackers. So to back up a bit, I remember when I set down this path of, it wasn't officially 12 startups in 12 months because I didn't sort of bookend things to 1 month. And I also didn't make my way through 12 startups before I landed on something. But I remember joining Indie Hackers. And then that was a Comfort Challenge. We can talk about Comfort Challenges later. Also remember saying, okay, I was in Atlanta. I'm going to try to go to a physical meetup. And I went to a meetup. That was another Comfort Challenge. I presented at that meetup what I was building at that point. That was a Comfort Challenge. And then I also asked a few guys at that group, because I heard rumblings. That was a monthly meetup, but I heard sort of, I don't know, rumors or people mentioning there was a more frequent meetup going on. So asking about that. And that's what was the 0 to 1 meetup. And they just met more frequently than the monthly Indie Hackers meetup. So I found out about 0 to 1 through Indie Hackers. All of these things were path dependent.
Yeah, and now there's been nearly 100 reports so far, right? And you're not still doing every single one. And how is it one of the hardest things for many people when they start a company or start a business is letting go of those reins. Now, you obviously started Trends.vc because you really enjoyed making the reports. But then when you're doing so many, it becomes tiring and you start to face burnout. Was there a trigger that made you start to bring other people on board? Or how did you go about those decisions?
Yeah, so a few things are in there. So a big switch for me, or at least what made me open to the idea that other people may be able to write the reports, because I struggled with that idea for about 6 to 8 months. There was just a period where I just didn't know, and it was an open question that I would ask every other day, was when I realized that I didn't have to divorce myself completely from the process. So I wrote the last report on revenue-based financing, but for example, the next 2 reports, they're pretty much in the can, and I didn't write them. But when I realized that I could be an editor and sort of that source of quality control, at least for the moment, that made me comfortable with the process. And I used to question early on with reports that I didn't write, where I didn't lead the research, but I still edited. I think this is better than when I wrote it. And now, after seeing that 6, 7, 8 times, I can definitively say that when someone else leads the research and editing process and they have the style guide and we're able to collaborate, again, with me in the editing role, that in my opinion, those reports are better than when I write them myself. But at first, that was just a bet. It was just a suspicion. And it took a very, very long time to find analysts that sort of fit what we needed there, just in terms of quality of thought, high signal writing. It's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of hard work. And some people see it. I think most people see it when they look at the report, but they're dense, they're concise, but it takes more work to write something that's shorter, in my opinion, than it's longer, because we go from sometimes 20,000 words down to less than 2,000, sometimes 2,000 words. There's a lot of work in condensing things. So.
There's that phrase which is, if I had more time, this article would have been shorter, or something along those lines.
Yeah, so Trends.vc, it feels like it's built on a few like core theses. And if there were 2 or 3 core theses, that's one of them. Yeah, that people would appreciate more concise content, that they see the value in, hey, I could give you this 20,000 word essay, or I can put the effort and time in to give you this 2,000 word essay. The fact that people would appreciate that was a big bet that paid off.
And it's when you look around everything on the internet, all right, all the information is available. If people wanted to find the information that you found, they could do it themselves. But how many hours would that take them? How much work would that be for them? And I think it's something which a lot of people, when they're considering content, don't necessarily think about. It's how can you get the message across in the shortest amount of time? Because that's what people want to pay for at the end of the day. It's the structure and the simplicity, because everything else is already out there. So what you're doing and the service you're providing is just saving people time on things they're interested in. And when did you start monetizing, or how did that monetization process work?
Yeah, so it became, I wouldn't say it became clear, because it wasn't a clear path to monetization, but pretty early on, we may have been 6 or 7 reports in when people started mentioning that, hey, you should charge for these, you should charge for these. It's not really a story technically, but a funny thing was everyone who said that, I'm not sure if anybody who said that ended up subscribing, but it was true for some people. Monetization came through a 2-stage process, where the first stage, we tried one method where, hey, this report is free, just a heads up, this is a topic for the next report, and you can pre-order the next report. No one pre-ordered. So when realizing that that wasn't going to work out, even before that report dropped, I did something differently. And maybe someone suggested this, but I released a report, and about half of it was free. You could pay to unlock the other half. And then subscriptions started to flow in. And it's like, okay, this will work. So that's roughly the path. And that also came after, I was going to say, I don't think this was a coincidence, but I know it wasn't a coincidence, after a report on paid newsletters, where in putting that report together, for someone who hasn't seen a report before, we have this structure where we have core problem, core solution, predictions, opportunities. But as we're getting to predictions, we have a lot of early examples of, hey, here's how this thing is already manifesting, to sort of give you like, support this thesis that we're building, or opportunities. Here are 5, 6, 7, 8 people that are capitalizing on this. So even if you don't feel like you can relate to everyone who's following down this path or capitalizing on this opportunity, perhaps you see 2 or 3 that resonate with you. But in going through that process and building that paid newsletter report, I saw so many cases where it's just like, even if I have to tweak the model, I think this is feasible, just because I heard back-to-back stories, and I also had to communicate and transfer and translate those stories to other people. I think some of that confidence and also strategy came through in how we make the jump from free to paid reports.
Have there been any other reports that have really made a difference to your business, where you were studying them because you're interested in them, and then you realize, wait, I can do this to my own business and apply this right now, and not just giving it to the audience?
Yes, and it goes both ways. Sometimes you go so deep into an area and you think that, okay, this is on my bucket list, that someday I would want a startup studio, for example. And you do a report on startup studios and you're like, okay, this isn't what I want, but you're able to articulate exactly why that is. And for anyone curious, with startup studios, there's this idea of opportunity cost, where invariably one of those ideas in your portfolio is going to have a higher expected return or sort of output per unit of input that you put in, but you're embracing that you're not going to maximize that expected value because you're chasing these other things with lower expected value. And some people, it just depends on what you're optimizing for. Maybe that's something that I'll change my mind on, but I'm more of a fan of focus these days. And it sounded fun, and I'm sure it is fun. And maybe people are optimizing for fun that do startup studios. But that was one downside. Another downside is that you're competing with people who are solely focused on one problem. So sure, it can be done. Startup studios, conglomerates may have tax benefits, but yeah, good luck competing with maniacal focused people for like a SaaS side project that's just part of your portfolio. And coming from the other end of reports or topics that we may have incorporated, it feels like it happens for every report, and it's not always obvious. Even the reports that I don't lead research on, I'm reading someone else's insights, or I'm reading two predictions. I'm like, okay, if we believe that those two things are true, this must also be true. But what does that mean for what we're building? There are some things where I'm already a believer, like the FIRE movement, for example, and I get more conviction out of doing a report like that. Here's one, decentralized finance, or more specifically, so we've done reports on decentralized finance. We've also done reports on NFTs, but our NFT collection, Metatrends, I built that while I was building the second report on NFTs. So it was sort of like a puzzle where it's just like I saw exactly how it would fit into our strategy. And we can talk about this later, but I tend to overthink things to a fault. So I make mistakes of omission instead of mistakes of commission because I overthink it. And I think that's actually a bad thing, where when you have two-way doors or in-way doors, you should probably just make a decision and go. But that's something that I'm working on.
Obviously, as we're doing this recording right now, the crypto market is in tatters, pretty much. Have any of the predictions you've made in previous reports started to come true? Or what's your predictions, if you had your crystal ball right now, of what's going to happen to the crypto market as we go forwards?
Yeah, I wanted to hedge. As you were asking the question, I wanted to hedge, but I'm not even going to hedge. I have and this hasn't been put in a report because we're very careful about how we frame predictions and opportunities. But I have a personal sort of list in my journal of theses. And I think that market cap, like if you go to coin market cap for all of the cryptocurrencies now, you'll see like 1.1 or 1.2 trillion. And I was going to say this is a hot take, but it's not even a hot take. It's more of a prediction that it feels like at a minimum, at least this is what I have in my journal of theses, that 100 trillion is more than reasonable for the market. So it feels like a cycle. We're in the bear right now. So that's one thing that comes up. And yeah, we could pull up a previous report and we could sort of do a retro on some past predictions of some crypto related topics. But yeah, we've covered a lot of them, social tokens, other crypto topics as well.
Are there any more general predictions where you remember making them and then you're really proud when it comes true in some fashion, where you can tell people like, I knew that was going to happen and the proof is there in that report?
This may not exactly answer your question. I'll try to save face for the parties involved, but there was one report that we released, and it was, I think, 2 days passed after the report came out, and we said something that may have not even been in the prediction section, but it was sort of an argument or in the risk category about why not to use a certain service, and it was related to custom domains where people were flocking to a service, but they didn't realize that if you don't own your top of funnel, these are sort of breadcrumbs that you're leaving around the web, and you don't control your top of funnel. So you can control your email list, but if for whatever reason you want to switch services and you can't switch services because you're on the subdomain and you don't, again, control that top of funnel, then it's just a strategic blunder, if you will. So I released that, got a lot of replies from some stakeholders in that company, from other people who were thankful when they didn't realize that they were about to make that same mistake. And then a few days later, that company released custom domains, which their story up to that point was that it was hard to do, but the company had tens of millions in funding, and there were 1 and 2 person operations, similar types of businesses that had custom domains. So I thought that was BS. And yeah, so it wasn't quite a prediction, but it was just giving people flack. And I feel like, users are in a better position now. I'm not saying we're the reason, but it was a hell of a coincidence after years and years of no custom domains.
It's interesting that as well, because I found this, you obviously realize as well, there's so many different companies in different spaces. And it's what you cover in other reports. And you sometimes wonder, like, you've got how much in funding? Why are you not solving the simple issues that, like, we can see just from the outside, just from reading about it for a day or 2 days? You've got, like you said, like tens of millions. Like, just fix it. It's not like we both come from like coding background.
This was the thing. In my
hard.
opinion, that wasn't the whole story. It was rent sinking, in my opinion, where it was to their advantage that they had this high lock-in, right? All else equal, you want extremely high lock-in. And that's what that led to. That was just the narrative. But for people that sort of saw below the narrative, we had this glaring issue. And a lot of people were being misled, unfortunately.
What's some of the tools that you use like today that you really believe in? Because as part of doing the reports, you're basically an expert in this area as well.
Card was the first one to mind in terms of talking about like a tool that I really believe in. And there are some tools, I'm not the person who said this, I just love the way they put it. When they said some tools you'll get $51 of value out of and you'll pay $50 for it. And with Card, it feels the opposite, where 10x feels like an underestimation of the sort of cost to benefit ratio that users get from that tool, where I think there are different plans, but you may pay $50 a year. And that's where we host our email opt-in page for example, and the tool constantly improves. So that comes to mind. We also use MailerLite. We use Circle. I'm trying to think of some other tools, Notion. But yeah, the tool that comes to mind that you talk about, okay, what tool do you really believe in? Circle was first to mind. Not Circle. Card was first to mind. Circle is in a different category.
Yeah, and like along the way now, because you've been running Trends.vc for a little while now, is there anything you do differently if you had to start from scratch today?
This is something I battle with because we just set or reset our 10-year target around a 30,000 member mastermind network by December 31st, 2030. And what contributes to that is the fact that we already have a vibrant community. But for a long time, and I'm still not sure what the answer here is, I struggled with whether we launched the community too early, because even after the community was self-sustaining, we still hadn't brought process and organization to the report process. So for me, it felt like building the reports was a full-time business. Delegating that process and again, building a system around it was another full-time job. And then we're also trying to build a community. And I think it slowed everything down. The fact that we launched the community without sort of operationalizing, if that's a word, the report process. So maybe that was the biggest one, if that was a mistake, because again, it's flowing into what's now our North Star, the fact that we've already proven this out.
Yeah, I can completely relate to that, because I think I do the same thing where something looks shiny and exciting, then I add it to my plate. But then I've added it to my plate, the other stuff is not properly, there's no proper systems in place. And then I'm trying to delegate the other stuff whilst doing the new things. And like I said, they're both full-time jobs. And they've just found it creates such a crunch period where you're overseeing somebody else's work and trying to, because often even if you rush the handover process, then there's some aspects which get forgotten about. And it might be tiny, but this can cause massive issues. And they blow up because you just don't think about them enough. And was there things like this that happened to you where as you were passing things over, then there was something you left out and then that then triggered like more problems? And how did you get out of that? How did you get out of that period where you seem to be working twice as hard?
Yes. So I'll tell you what happened. I'll tell you how I solved it. I think this was also a mistake in terms of waiting too late, because it reached a point, I believe this was March of 2021, where for 6, 7, 8 months, I sort of ran at more than twice the speed, building a community up, still writing reports. And I remember having a conversation with one of our members, and we sort of built like an offline friendship as well. And I was telling her that I'm at the point now where it sort of doesn't matter if people get mad or unsubscribe, but like I can't continue to run at like 3 times the pace as when there were just reports. So we went to biweekly reports, and something interesting happened when that happened, and I announced it. Was that there was one cancellation that was from a person that had just subscribed like a day or two before that. But then there were like 40 or 50 messages that were super supportive, and also people saying things like, I was struggling to keep up with reading the reports. So I didn't say this to anybody, but it's like, imagine the person building them out. Like I was struggling to push them out. So people were behind and now they could catch up. So that was sort of this imaginary dragon that I was fighting, but that's how I solved it, at least in the short term. And then the longer term solution was, again, to throw a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of capital at hiring analysts and vetting analysts. That process was another 6 to 7 months. And I learned a lot in that process that now go into shapes the way we would probably hire for any position.
So now that you've got people on board helping you out and you've got it down to like 2 reports per month, how do you spend your time generally? Like, what's the bits of the business that you still run, and what are the bits you're doing outside of the business too?
Yeah, so I was just looking at our accountability chart. The short answer is everywhere. Like I'm still very involved in reports where we have this daily process. It's very similar to stand-ups, but with analysts where they can participate in stand-ups. They don't have to, but they send me weekday daily updates in terms of, hey, here's what I tackled yesterday. Here's what I plan to do today. And here's what I need help with. And for example, we have it down to the point where if it's like key lessons or opportunities, I'll jump in and do some research or look at what they have and come up with predictions or opportunities. So I'm still very involved in that process. Also shaping and launching new masterminds. I spend a lot of time there. Again, the community, it reached a point where it was self-sustaining pretty early. So I just have to make more or less design decisions as we release new automations. We're doing a lot of automations around how we're tracking the quality and also attendance rates of masterminds. So writing specs, sort of like a product manager from that standpoint for developers that we work with. What else? Interviews like this. Running community events. Right before this interview, I was in an event that we call Trends Tribe, which is based on another tool that we use called Gather.town. So maybe a little too much context switching, but I'm not complaining. It feels like there are plans to, I guess, bring more focus to my days and delegate more things. And now it's just a matter of executing on those plans.
What do you enjoy the most out of all of those tasks?
Just design thinking, building systems, building processes, thinking about second, third order effects. And it used to bug me because I was going to say it used to be the hardest part of building a community or building a business. I think it's still the hardest part, but it's the thing that gives me the most energy. And if I had to trace this back to anything, I think it's all of those hours spent playing Civilization as a kid that made me love this. And it's just hard because I may have mentioned this earlier, but talking about one-way doors, two-way doors, in-way doors, some decisions you make when you're building a process is really hard to reverse. So I think the stakes can be extremely high, but it's also interesting to play with leverage. Just, okay, I can make this one decision and it can improve things. Sure, it can make things get worse, but it can also improve things across the board.
I think it's one of those curses, isn't it, of a lot of people who have like entrepreneurial mindsets, is that what they enjoy most is the most challenging thing, which then creates all the pressure, it creates all the responsibility and the stress that comes with that too. And you mentioned before how because you delayed getting other people on board, that made you more stressed out. It got to that point where you had to go down to twice a month because you just couldn't take it anymore. But like where you are now, from the outside looking in, it seems like you've got the balance right. It seems like everything is running well and you've got people working with you. You're able to focus on, even though you're focusing on different aspects of Trends.vc, you're not having to, say, take on clients. You're not having to do other things to try to fund it anymore. How do you feel about where you are now? Is this where you want to continue? Or is there things behind the scenes that are maybe you want to change that you're struggling with?
Yeah, I saw a quote and I won't even try to repeat it verbatim. So I'll just try to paraphrase. But it basically said, smile because you're exactly where, or you're further along than you wanted to be 5 years ago, or something to that degree. And yeah, I thought about that. So if we rewind to 2017, I just left that consulting gig. I didn't know what I was building. I wasn't in a rush to build anything. I just wanted some time off and a break. But it feels like I found a sort of means of self improvement, which can be building a business, which can be building an organization. And that's where I'm at, where I found a good balance between working in the business and on the business. So I'm happy with where things are at right now. And there have been periods, especially all of those months spent looking for analysts, where that was the North Star, was to be able to take some of the pressure off of myself. And there are still pressure points, for example, looking for an editor, which will probably be someone who gets promoted internally. But it's not something where it's like I'm in an absolute rush to do that. I still enjoy the editing process. So that's fun. We're still iterating. We're still, throwing iterations at the process. Each time a report comes through the process that we built, the process evolves. So I'm not in a rush to do that. Things feel like they're in a good spot, knock on wood.
So you asked me this before we started recording. I'm going to throw the question back onto you again. So I mentioned to you that it's been 1 year now since I've been my own boss. And you said, where do you want to be in 10 years' time? So I told you my answer off recording. But what's your answer? Where do you want to be in 10 years' time?
So I think a lot of your listeners will understand or know about a book called Traction by Gino Wickman. There's 2 books called Traction. One is by Gino Wickman, and he promotes this system called the Entrepreneurial Operating System. And we've been using that for about 4 quarters now. And they have this idea of the visionary and the integrator. And it feels like we don't have to go into childhood trauma and all these other things, but I'm like an integrator. I have the skills to be an integrator, but by force, because just to survive, I've had to build those skills to be an integrator. And I think I'm a pretty good integrator, but I think I'm a great visionary. So 10 years from now, I would love to be in a position where this could be in title or in practice, but there is a COO or even a CEO, and I'm more of in a chairman role with Trends.vc, where we've, at this point, 10 years from now, have hit our 10-year target of building a 30,000 member mastermind network of freedom-loving founders. And we still have the newsletter and other top of funnel content, and we're internet native and we're global. So yeah, I think another part of that question that I asked you is, what does your day-to-day look like? So right now, if I'm spending, some days it feels like 60-40 in terms of working in the business 60% of the time, working on the business 40% of the time that I'm spending on it. At that point, I would love that ratio to skew maybe 80-20 working on to working in, or 90-10. I don't want to take out that working in the business, because I genuinely enjoy masterminds. And I think there's this interesting feedback loop that happens when you're building a community, because when it was just reports, I used to set up weekly customer interviews with pro members. And now there's just no need to do that, because Trends Tribe, I'm having conversations with people. Masterminds, I'm having conversations with people. I'm hearing struggles. I can't tell you the number of topics for reports that have just come out of hearing someone talk about, hey, I'm struggling with how to build in public, or I'm thinking about pre-sales, or I don't know how to navigate lifetime deals, or things like that. So I'm like, boom, there's an idea. Boom, there's an idea. So I always want to have, an ear to the streets or be in the business somehow.
I want to go back to what you said about the integration and the visionary, because I feel like I can relate to on this aspect as well, because I didn't intend to, because my background is in tech consulting. I kind of did that by accident. I thought I was applying for more of a business consultant role, but I was then there for 7 years. So I built up the technology skills, and now I use those regularly in what I'm doing, and I can build the systems. And part of me enjoys that, but in reality, I want to be the visionary. That's the bit I enjoy more. And I think there's a struggle for people like ourselves where, because we can do the tech side, we can do the integration side, we end up doing it. And it's so hard to let go of, because like I said, because you're good at it, then you're like, well, I should carry on doing it. And how do you split this up in your mind about the difference between what you're good at and what you want to do?
This is a very tactical answer that I'm about to give you for a very general question that you asked. So that's just a warning. Tactically, this has been helping for about a month or 2 months, where I have this process called A.E.D.O, A.E.D.O, and it resembles the Eisenhower process. But what it means to me is A is for automate, E is for eliminate, D is for delegate, and O is for own. And I went back and forth where some days I won't do it, and then I'm reminded of why this matters. But as I set my priorities for the next day, this is the night before, I annotate each to do with an A. Hey, you can automate this thing. Even if it's urgent, I'll just take care of it, but you can automate this thing. D, you can delegate it. And E, this shouldn't be something that should be done by anybody long term. Or O, I should own this. And it's just a reminder for me where, for example, we just had a weekly planning meeting earlier today. And there were things that I delegated in that call that, unless I had this sort of mental hook or this mental trigger that I've been asking myself for the last few days, that this thing is sort of urgent, but it can wait until after the weekly check-in and you can put this on someone else's plate. It would have never occurred to me that I could have delegated that thing. There were a few other things where I think that there is some value to the sort of vision and the building being within one brain or one person. And there are a million counterexamples to this where the opposite is true. But I think that there can be some benefits to that. And speaking for myself, I think that I need to become probably 10 times better in terms of communication and clarity of thought before I can become like a really good visionary. It's what I enjoy, what gives me energy. But I've also, and I'll probably get a lot of flack from this, not the biggest fan of Steve Jobs, but was an extremely clear thinker. And that's one thing I admire about him. And a few other people, Jane Portman also comes to mind. Just certain people come to mind in terms of their clarity of thought. Seth Godin, his clarity of thought is crazy. And what they tend to have in common is that they write a lot. So maybe that's one way that I or listeners can practice just in terms of getting some clarity of thought, because there are certain things I can walk around with for weeks or months in my head and assume that other people know, or of course, this is why we're making this decision. But unless you're over communicating and being super clear about this vision, then yeah, you can be the visionary, but if you're trying to work with integrators or you're trying to delegate, it's not as effective if they don't understand where you're rowing and why you're rowing in that direction. Tactically, one thing that we've done to help out with this is we use Notion. So at the top of our check-in docs, you can always add like a cover image. So when I talk about this 10-year target, I basically made a graphic in Figma, and it's at the top of all our check-in documents now. So it's this constant reminder that whenever we reference this document, where we're headed, what's that North Star?
Yeah, there's a lot of different interesting things you said there. So with Steve Jobs, I agree as well, because I think there's a lot when you look into the details of what he did and some of the things he did in terms of, for example, eating carrots for weeks or months because he thought that it made him more creative. That's not a healthy thing that people should follow. And sometimes people need to separate out someone's success from all of their methods, because some of their methods aren't actually effective, and it's in spite of their methods they were successful rather than because of them. And what you mentioned there as well about you have an idea in your head for months and you want to share that with integrators. But the thing is, it's been in your head for months, right? Because it's your baby. You care about it so much. Whereas for an integrator or somebody you're hiring, for many of them, like they'll support you, they'll do the best work, but they'll switch off about it because it's not, they're getting a salary, they're getting the money regardless of whether or not they late at night thinking about it. And I think it's really hard to understand that for somebody who loves their business so much, is that other people, it's a paycheck and that's okay. They don't need to think about it as much as you do. But I think that's what a lot of founders sometimes make a mistake in it, and they think that everybody else thinks about it as much as they do. So if you mention it once, like how many things have something been mentioned once to me and I forget about it? So it needs to be, like I said, over communicated to actually make the impact. And then the one final point there as well is you mentioned the target of 30,000 people in the membership. Two things on that. Why did you get to that number in the first place? Why that particular number? And then how do you plan on getting there?
Yeah. And just to clarify, so it's not necessarily 30,000 people in the membership, and it's very likely that membership numbers will be much higher just for us to get to that number in terms of people that are actively in masterminds, because I didn't explain this before, but have stand-ups, and stand-ups act as the gateway to unlock many other features. So Trends Tribe is unlocked through a 3-day stand-up streak. Hall of Fame is unlocked through a 10-day stand-up streak. Masterminds right now are unlocked through a 30-day stand-up streak. And there are a few reasons why we're doing that, but how did we come to this number? And it comes from thinking, I think it started out at 10,000, but it came from thinking about it should probably be higher, but how do you build a community to a scale where you can help a lot of people, but it doesn't lose character? Where I often talk about Twitter isn't a community, Facebook isn't a community, these are networks. Communities usually don't have the level of disagreement and vitriol that like a Facebook or Twitter can have. There's some core like underlying value or underlying thread in the beliefs of a community. Sure, there's tension. Sure, there's conflict. Sure, there's disagreement. There are people in Trends Pro right now that have different views on whether you should raise funds. And of course, the answer is it depends on what you're building, what you want, what's your motivation, what's good or feasible for the business. But there are also people that come at this from a quote unquote religious standpoint. They have those thoughts. But I think at the root, what we share is our love of agency, our love of freedom over fame and other things. So that's a community. And maybe my thoughts around this will change, but I think that's harder to maintain at 100,000 or 300,000 or a million, where perhaps it makes sense for another movement to be organized for a group. Well, I wouldn't say a group of that size, but for a group with a different perspective.
Yeah, and how do you plan on getting to the 30,000 active members?
Yeah, so like everything else, it will be very path dependent. So some things that we're looking at for Q3, where I have a long journal of like ideas, but increasing number of touch points that we have. So one drawback of going from weekly to biweekly reports is that for most subscribers, they only hear from us twice a month now. And that's a problem for feedback loops. That's a problem for iterations and evolution. That's a problem for mind share. That creates all of these second order effects that maybe I didn't think about at the moment, but I would have still made the same decision, because I talk about the ratio of being able to spend maybe 60, 40, 70, 30 on the business versus in the business these days. Then it was probably 90, 10 in the business versus on the business. So just to break out of that cycle, I had to change something. But increasing the number of touch points, when I'm working on a new content type right now, where it's not fully baked, so I don't want to talk about it too much, because I'll end up saying something and then that turns out not to be true the more that I build out this sort of spec or vision for that product. And we're also building a lot of custom code around the way that we start masterminds, the way that we track masterminds, the quality of masterminds, attendance, feedback, all of that. And talking about sort of getting clarity on your vision as a visionary and then being able to share that with others. I've had to do that as I'm working with developers or even people that are currently in masterminds, to share with them sort of why are we taking this path? Why aren't we using off-the-shelf software? We can't necessarily be married to someone else's product map or what's good for them if we have this ambitious vision around like where we're going and sort of the unique perspective that we have on masterminds, why we do them, how they should be organized. So custom code, and then also more touch points. So touch points, top of funnel. Custom code is more around scalability, making sure that we can handle that throughput.
So it's been great talking to you today, Drew.
Yeah, likewise.
Can you tell the listeners where they can hear more about you and more about Trends? So hopefully we can help you get to your 30,000, or at least a little bit today.
Yeah, so I would say just go to Trends.vc. One thing that I think we talked about pre-interview was sort of about was about the relative size of personal to business brands. That's intentional, where I'm trying to build up Trends.vc and kind of fade into the background personally. So there will probably be tidbits about me in this new newsletter type or this new product type that we're thinking about launching. So I would just, channel all attention to Trends.vc. Just opt in and check out reports.
All right. Well, great to have you on.
Likewise. Thank you, man.